A waitress stands up for a man being bullied and gets fired on the spot. Unfair? Absolutely. But what no one expected was what happened next, because just hours later, over 100 bikers showed up, and what they did left the entire town speechless. Sarah had been working at Harris Diner for over a year. It wasn't fancy, but it paid the bills. Most of the customers were regulars, locals, truckers, and travelers passing through. She had seen all kinds of people come and go, but that night, someone different walked in. The door swung open, and in stepped Mike, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a worn leather jacket. His thick beard and dark sunglasses gave him an intimidating look, but when he spoke, his voice was calm. "Just a coffee, please." Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed a cup and poured the steaming liquid, setting it in front of him with a smile. She had no idea that this simple act of kindness would change her life forever. Across the diner, a group of well-dressed regulars, businessmen, the town's elite, eyed Mike with distaste. They exchanged whispers and chuckles, throwing glances his way. "Bikers don't belong in places like this," one of them muttered, loud enough for Sarah to hear. She ignored them and continued working, but the tension in the air was impossible to miss. Then it happened. One of the men, Mark, the loudest of the group, picked up his coffee cup, walked past Mike, and accidentally spilled the scalding liquid down Mike's sleeve. "Oops," Mark sneered. "Guess I'm just clumsy today." His friends chuckled. Mike didn't react. He simply wiped his sleeve with a napkin and went back to his coffee. But Sarah? She had enough. She marched over, her voice steady but firm. "Sir, that wasn't an accident," Mark smirked. "Relax, sweetheart. We're just having a little fun." The entire diner fell silent. Other customers watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah's hands clenched into fists, but before she could say another word, a voice cut through the air. "Everything all right?" Mike finally spoke, his deep voice calm but powerful. His eyes, now visible behind the sunglasses, locked onto Mark's. Mark's smirk faltered. For the first time that night, he looked nervous. Sarah felt a strange sense of relief, like she wasn't alone in this fight. But she had no idea. This was only the beginning. Sarah refused to back down. She turned to Mark, her voice unwavering. "Sir, I need you to apologize." The diner went dead silent. Mark's friends exchanged glances before bursting into laughter. "Apologize? To a biker? To some low-life thug?" Mark scoffed. "You must be joking." But Sarah wasn't joking. She stood her ground, looking straight at Mark. The amusement on his face faded, replaced with irritation. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by a waitress. Before Mark could respond, Mike set his coffee down and slowly stood up. The diner suddenly felt much smaller. "She asked you to apologize," Mike said, his voice calm but firm. Mark's bravado cracked. His eyes darted around as if looking for an escape, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. Instead, he turned to Sarah. "You know what? You're fired," Mark spat. Sarah's heart stopped. "What?" she gasped. "You can't fire me. You don't even own this place." "No, but my brother does," Mark sneered, nodding toward the manager. A man standing behind the counter, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Sarah turned to her boss, desperately searching for support. "You know this isn't right," she pleaded. But the manager just sighed, shaking his head. He wasn't going to challenge Mark. "Sorry, Sarah. Just go home." The words hit like a punch to the stomach. She had done the right thing, and now she had nothing. Her hands trembled as she untied her apron and placed it on the counter. With one last look at Mike, who stood watching, his expression unreadable, she turned and walked out. The cold night air stung her face. She had never felt more alone. Inside the diner, Mike remained still, watching as Sarah disappeared into the night. Then, without a word, he pulled out his phone. He dialed a number, lifted it to his ear, and spoke only 3 words. "It's time, boys." And with that, everything was about to change. Sarah sat on the curb outside the diner, her hands clenched into fists, fired, for standing up for someone. It didn't seem real. She thought about going back inside, demanding justice. But what was the point? Mark and his friends owned the place. She was just a waitress, a nobody, or so she thought. Because while she sat there, broken and humiliated, a storm was brewing, and soon the entire town would feel it. Inside the diner, Mike put his phone away and finished his coffee in one slow sip. The silence in the diner was deafening. Mark smirked. "You're not going to cause trouble, are you, big guy?" Mike didn't respond. He simply dropped a few bills on the table, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the door. Right before stepping outside, he turned his head just slightly. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, voice low and steady. Then he was gone. Mark let out a scoff, shaking his head. Pathetic. His friends chuckled. They had no idea. Out in the parking lot, Mike swung a leg over his motorcycle and revved the engine. The deep roar echoed through the empty streets. One by one, headlights flickered on. A dozen bikes lined up in the distance, engines rumbling. They had been waiting. Mike didn't need to say anything. His brothers already knew. It was time. With a nod, he twisted the throttle and took off down the road. Not alone, but leading a pack. And they were heading straight for Sarah. Sarah wiped at her eyes, trying to push down the frustration. What now? Where would she go? Then she heard it. At first, just a faint hum, then a deep, rolling thunder that rattled the pavement. She looked up. Headlights, dozens of them, coming straight toward her. Her breath caught in her throat as 100 bikers filled the street, surrounding the diner, engines roaring like a war cry. And at the front of the pack, leading them all, was Mike. Something big was about to happen. And this time, Sarah wasn't alone. Inside the diner, Mark and his friends were still laughing, completely unaware of what was happening outside. Then, the ground began to shake. The low rumble of engines grew louder, rattling the windows. One by one, customers turned their heads toward the glass. Their faces paled. Mark frowned. "What the—" Then, the doors burst open. The entire diner fell silent as Mike stepped inside, followed by nearly 100 bikers. The air was thick with tension. Leather jackets, steel-toe boots, the smell of gasoline. They weren't here to order coffee. Mark swallowed hard. His cocky grin disappeared. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, forcing a chuckle. Mike didn't smile, didn't blink. He just stepped forward, his voice low and controlled. "You owe Sarah an apology." Mark scoffed, but his voice cracked. "For what? She got herself fired." Mike took another step closer. "Apologize." The other bikers moved in, slow, steady, like wolves closing in. Mark's friends shrank back, suddenly very quiet. Even the diner manager, Mark's brother, looked away. Mark licked his lips, eyes darting around. No one was on his side. Finally, with a shaky breath, Mark lowered his head. "Sarah, I'm sorry." Outside, Sarah watched through the window, her heart pounding. She never expected an apology, and she definitely never expected this. But then, Mike turned to the manager. "Now, give her job back." And that's when things really got interesting. The manager, Mark's brother, looked like he wanted to disappear. His eyes flicked between the bikers and Mark, clearly debating his next move. He was afraid. Finally, he let out a nervous chuckle. "Look, there's no need for all this drama. It's just a misunderstanding." Mike cut him off. "Give her job back." The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. The kind of weight that couldn't be ignored. Mark, still shaken, grabbed his brother's arm. "Just do it," he hissed under his breath. The manager sighed, rubbing his forehead. He knew he had no choice. "Fine," he muttered. Then, louder, "Sarah, if you want your job back, it's yours." A murmur ran through the diner. The other customers, who had been watching in stunned silence, started nodding, whispering. Sarah blinked, hardly believing what she was hearing. "Are you serious?" she asked. The manager forced a tight-lipped smile. "Dead serious." Sarah felt a wave of emotions crash over her. Relief, disbelief, gratitude. But before she could answer, Mike spoke again. "She doesn't need your job." The room went silent. Sarah turned to him, confused. "What?" she asked. Mike smiled for the first time that night. "You stood up for me. Now it's my turn to stand up for you." Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Sarah hesitated before taking it. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, and then her breath caught. A job offer. At a biker-owned bar and grill just outside town. Better pay, better hours, and a boss who actually respected her. Sarah looked up at Mike, eyes wide. "You serious?" Mike nodded. "You don't belong here, kid. You belong somewhere you're appreciated." Tears welled up in her eyes. For the first time all night, she felt like she'd truly won. And Mark? He had never looked smaller. Sarah stared at the job offer, emotions swirling inside her. Gratitude, disbelief, freedom. Mark and his brother stood frozen, watching helplessly as their power slipped away. The other customers? They weren't whispering anymore. They were smiling. Some even clapped. Sarah took a deep breath, folded the paper, and looked Mark straight in the eye. "Keep your job." And with that, she turned away, walking out of the diner with her head held high. As soon as Sarah stepped outside, she was met with a wall of leather jackets and roaring engines. The bikers cheered. Mike grinned. "So, you in?" Sarah wiped away a tear, then smirked. "I don't know. Does the new job come with a ride?" Mike laughed and patted the seat behind him. "Hop on." She hesitated for just a second, then swung a leg over the bike. For the first time in her life, she felt weightless. The engines roared to life. One by one, the bikers pulled out, forming a long, unstoppable line down the street, a force to be reckoned with. Inside the diner, Mark watched, still stunned. The girl he fired? She wasn't just leaving, she was leaving in style. And as the last bike disappeared down the road, Mark finally slumped into a chair, rubbing his face. He had lost. As Sarah held on to Mike, the wind rushing through her hair, she closed her eyes and smiled. She had stood up for what was right. She had lost everything, but gained something even greater: respect, freedom, and a new family. And in that moment, as the road stretched out ahead, she knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. A few days later, Sarah stood outside her new workplace, a lively biker-owned bar and grill. It was nothing like the diner. The air was filled with laughter, music, and the scent of sizzling burgers. The staff greeted her like an old friend. She belonged here. Mike leaned against his bike, watching her take it all in, So, better than the diner? He teased. Sarah laughed. 1,000 times better. Meanwhile, back at the diner, things had taken a turn. Word had spread about what happened. The diner's reputation was in ruins. Customers had stopped coming. Online reviews were brutal. People called out the mistreatment of Sarah and the way Mark handled things. Even the regulars had found new spots to eat. Mark and his brother? They were panicking. One slow afternoon, Mark sat at the counter scrolling through his phone. Every single review was bad. Then, the bell above the door jingled. His heart leapt. Finally, a customer. But when he looked up, his face paled. It was Sarah. She walked in, cool and confident, placing a crisp $20 bill on the counter. Just came to tip the new waitress. She smiled sweetly. Mark gritted his teeth, but he couldn't say a word. He had lost, not just his dignity, but his business. Sarah turned to leave, but then paused at the door. "Oh, and Mark," she said, glancing back. "Next time, maybe be a little nicer to people. You never know who's got their back." With that, she walked out for the last time. Outside, a biker revved his engine. She hopped on, giving the diner one final look. Then, with a roar, they sped off, leaving Mark in the dust. Justice? Served.